Carolina has won the game.
With 5 seconds, he's going to throw it. Howard leaps. He has it. Touchdown. Carolina back from the dead to tie the game with 2 seconds to go. There is a flag down, but holy smokes.
2 and 4 in overtime games. Carolina 1 and 3. Here from under center. Give off to Greg Little. Little pulls away. Little is going to score. Carolina wins.
Snap back, spot down. The kick is cleanly away. It is good!
And it's
with
yes,
a 54-yard field goal. And how about them Tar Heels? They do it!
Possible win. Snap, spot, kick away, high enough, long enough. It's good! It's good! Carolina has won the game on a 42-yard field goal by freshman Hunter Burns.
In his end zone. The punt, very high. Switzer will have room to return it. He fields it at the 40. Coming near side, Switzer at the 50. Switzer, 45, cuts back at the 40. 35, breaks a tackle at the 30. Still on his feet. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Ryan Switzer for 6. He is doing his best Giovanni Bernard impression. Ryan Switzer again. Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It's your host, Anthony Pagnotta, with you guys as always. And I know that baseball's going on. I know Carolina baseball about to get their game started against Wake Forest here in about 20 minutes or so. Vance Honeycutt, by the way, back in the lineup if you guys are interested about that. But we got to get on here and do an update on the 2025 recruiting trail as we get prepared. A big month of official visits is coming up. We'll actually get you guys prepared for that coming up here sometime next week. So make sure you're keeping an eye out for that. But tonight, we got to kind of reset where everything is in this 2025 class right now, because for Carolina, you know, they've got 10 commitments, but it's a weird 10 commitments. It's guys that I think, you know, we are excited about, but there's some different things surrounding this group that we have to talk about. And guys, we have someone joining us tonight. It's been a while, but he is back, and that is Zack Hubbard, our guy. Zack, what is going on, man? I know it's been a while, but how you been doing, man? I'm excited to have you back here to break down this class with me, and we'll be doing this throughout the summer together once again.
Yeah, doing well. Glad to be back. You know, like you mentioned, you know, there's a lot going on, but recruiting never stops. So, you know, we're getting ever closer and closer to that month of June where we're going to see official visits. You sort of see at the end of June, early July, you see, you know, guys start to make their decisions ahead of senior seasons. So, you know, there's a lot going on and there's a lot to be excited about. Yeah,
no, there's no doubt about that. And look, when we look at this class and where it sits right now, I mean, there are 10 commitments already to this point, and you have 3 4-stars that headline the top of the class. 4-star offensive tackle Alex Payne, the number 133 overall player. You have Bryce Baker, who's number 237 overall, according to 24/7 Sports composite player rankings. That's what we always go off of. 4-star edge rusher Austin Alexander, who ranks 375 overall. And then you get to the guys that are just outside of that, guys that we have talked about in the past. We consider these guys blue chip prospects. 3-star safety Javian Butts, who ranks 435 overall. Marshall Pritchett, the 3-star tight end, who ranks 486 overall. And then there's a few other guys, 3-star linebacker Anthony Crua, who is just outside of the top 500 at 568. You have 3-star tight end Logan Farrell. So Carolina really loading up early on at the tight end position. He is number 743 overall. 3-star edge rusher, Caden Ladenschlager. He is 760th overall. And Trey Blue, the number 818 overall prospect in this class, a 3-star interior offensive lineman from the home state. And look, when you look at this class, I think one thing that really stands out to me is that while it may not have the heavy hitters that some of the other classes had, and that's something that I think we certainly have to talk about in its own right here tonight, I do think that this is a group of guys where in the past, Carolina's had guys that are ranked outside of the top 1,000, everything like that. And look, it's still early. There are guys that could end up being there. But it was really a delineation where there were certain guys that were headliners that were really highly ranked. And then there were guys that were very clear. You could see that there was a drop-off, and those were guys that were developmental. There's some developmental guys here. There's no doubt. Carolina's got a few of those in this class already. But I do think that this is probably a more evenly balanced class. And, Zach, it's why I think this class is ranked as highly as it is, even with 10 commitments to this point. It's still ranked 22nd according to 24/7 Sports composite team rankings. I think this class is in a pretty good spot. What do you think about where it stands?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think it's in a pretty good spot. I think it is a little bit different. I mean, we're seeing guys from, different areas that we're not used to seeing. There is, like you mentioned, a good balance of guys that feel like they could be early contributors, and then guys that feel a little bit more developmental. One of the biggest things thus far is you already have a quarterback locked in, not only, a blue chip, a 4-star quarterback, but one that's going to the Elite 11. So that's, one of the biggest things here. That's been something that's been paramount to North Carolina's success on the football field the past, 5 seasons, if not longer, of what Carolina football has been over the past decade. So I think that they're in a really good spot. I think just sort of taking a 5,000-foot view of everything, it is going to be a little bit of a smaller class. And we sort of, saw things in the past sort of post-season portal cycle that seem to reflect that they're shifting what they're doing a little bit, or I think they're shifting what they're doing a little bit. I think it could be a smaller class because they'll want to save spots for, transfers, for guys from other, not only Power 5 teams, but also potentially G5, FCS, things like that, to sort of fill in those spots and sort of really try to make some of their hay there. And then, they're going to have these developmental guys. They're going to have these guys from high school, but I don't think it's going to be a class that is, 23 to 25. It's probably more along the lines of 18 to 22, if I had to guess. So I think that obviously they're going to have a few more spots that they want to fill, but they've got a really good foundation right now. And, they're just looking for those few guys that they have left that they want to fill into certain positions. I'd say probably mainly at the skill talent. They probably want to add numbers there at wide receiver and then defensive back, but they're already in a good spot with a lot of places that they are. They've got a good foundation, like I mentioned, at quarterback, tight end. They've already got 2 there. They have a good start at offensive line and defensive line. And then they feel pretty good about where they stand at linebacker. So with 10 commits, it is a little bit weird. But I think that they're in a good spot overall. And I mean, like you mentioned, currently as base, at least on the 24/7 composite rankings at 23, that's about, what they do in any given year. Now we've seen some fluctuations into, the top 10, top 15, top 20, but 23, I think right now is a pretty good spot to be. If they stay around there, I think that they're about where they want to be overall.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. You're right. I think the assessment of them wanting to bring in a smaller class is spot on. I think, honestly, they have no choice. I mean, this is an incredibly young roster. This is a group. I mean, every position, when you go through it and you look at it, just about every position, underclassmen have more scholarship spots taken than the upperclassmen. The only position group that I look at and really say that it is upperclassmen heavy is the defensive line. Even the offensive line this year, with all the guys that they brought in the transfer portal, there are a few guys that are younger. And so this is a group that I think, because of how many young guys Carolina already has on the roster, it's going to be hard to see this being a big class. You mentioned that they've done a really good job on the defensive line. One guy I forgot to mention in there, Devin Ankrum, who's not a composite ranked player, but is a 3-star according to 24/7 Sports. That's their big guy in the middle. And then you've got 2 edge rushers, which I think is crucial. Carolina needed to go out and get help there. I think especially with Kamen Rucker departing, Austin Alexander is a guy that's already 6'3", 243. So he's a guy that I think they probably look at, hey, if we can add probably about 20 pounds to his frame when he gets to Carolina, he could probably end up being the guy that takes over for Des Evans at that power end spot, something like that. That's one of the areas that Carolina, I think, needed to address. The other area, I think you can never have enough guys along that offensive line. And also tight end. I mean, you said they've got their guys committed there. Quarterback is always a spot that you need. Those are 2 spots where right now they've got their guys. Tight end, they definitely needed those guys because barring a rough season for them, Bryson Nesbitt is a guy that's going to go to the NFL. He's a guy that right now is projected as either the 2nd or 3rd tight end off the board in next year's draft. John Copenhaver is a senior. He's going to be out of eligibility. So you're going to lose both of those guys. Jake Johnson will be an upperclassman as well. So I think they need to get someone in there for the future. And they bring in 2 guys that it seems like this staff already really likes. And Marshall Pritchett, who I think is, there's the stereotypical guy that can play in the slot. He's a weapon, man. 6'5", 211. He's good enough to play on the outside if Carolina ever really needed him to be a guy that just makes the transition out there. But he's also a guy that I truly believe has what it takes to play tight end. I think he has to prove himself a little bit as a blocker, but there's not going to be, if he stays there, there's not going to be a better route running tight end in the ACC if he can continue to grow in the areas that he needs to. And then you got Logan Farrell, who I think is a little bit more physical. He's built a little bit thicker at 6'3", 235. He's going to be more your stereotypical run blocker. I think, a guy like Copenhaver is exactly the type of guy that you're expecting him to become. A guy that in high school, they really lean on him in the passing game, but because of his frame, I think some of the things that we've seen from him on tape, he can become that guy. So I really like where this class stands just in terms of the guys that Carolina already has committed. I think there's some underrated guys that I think if they have big senior seasons, you could see some of these guys trend upwards. And I think there's, a good balance across the board at the positions that they really need guys. One of the other things, Zach, and we talked about this in last year's class, but this year, it's becoming even more evident just based on the number of offers that Carolina has given out to players in the state of Georgia. But now, you look at the guys that are committed, the top player in the class as of right now from the state of Georgia, and then you've got 4 other guys out of the state that are committed to this class. Carolina is really focusing on that state, and it makes a lot of sense. The state of Georgia right now, probably you stack it up against the rest of the states throughout the country, it's probably either 3rd or 4th in terms of the type of talent that it produces. And the other states that it's going up against, the populations are way bigger than this state. There is so much talent, especially in that Atlanta area, and you have to credit this staff for the job that they are doing there, because this is really where they've put together this class so far, and you'd expect that it's going to be their source for really putting together the rest of the class as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been a big point of emphasis just overall. If you look not even at recruiting, if you look at the roster, they have almost as many guys from the state of Georgia as they do from North Carolina. So it's a big area of focus for this staff, really overall. Like you mentioned, it's a state that in recent years has been, pretty heavily on the rise. Generally you think of California, you think of Texas, you think of Florida. Well, here in recent years, Georgia is becoming more and more sort of in that grouping of, these are schools where you're going to have the elite of the elite, but you're also going to have a ton of depth. So I think that's largely what North Carolina is trying to do at this point, is sort of, they have a ton of depth, even the guys that aren't going to be, your 5 stars, your top 10s, or even top, 100 guys, there's going to be good talent there. And I think it's becoming a situation where, Georgia is not only becoming a good state, but the reason it becomes a good state is because it's a place that a lot of people have moved to in recent years. So it's a transitory state. So there's not this huge incentive for guys to stay in state. Obviously you have, the in-state schools. You got the big one in UGA, which is gonna get their pick of the litter, but you see guys go all over. You see guys go to Clemson, you see them go to Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, you see them go all over, the Southeast. So it's a really smart strategy, I think, to be sort of in that market, for guys in Georgia. I think that the coaches that they have on the staff, I think that they have those good connections there to get into Georgia high schools. And I think it's an overall good strategy to have outside of just your traditional areas of, North and South Carolina and Southern Virginia. If you can get into Georgia, I think most of the time it's a pretty good strategy.
Yeah, and look, I mean, Carolina was kind of already getting into the state of Georgia a little bit when you first got Mack Brown back. But I think really, you said it, the guys that are on staff now, I think they've almost shifted. We were talking so much about the state of Virginia, and that was really driven heavily by Dre Bly, who was a member of the defensive back coaching group at the time. Well, now there's another member of that coaching group that is really making the push there as well, and that's Charlton Warren. That's the guy that I think has really led all of this, because you saw when he came in, there was a different focus. You saw so many other guys in that state getting offered. And the interesting thing is it started in that defensive back room, but it's really carried to other positions. And part of that is you look at the guys that Carolina has added. Chip Lindsey, offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach, guy out of the state of Georgia, or a guy out of the SEC, recruited the state of Georgia very heavily, especially at Auburn. When you're at Auburn, there's certain schools, Woodward Academy, that's pretty much a factory for guys that go to Auburn. Atlanta is a spot they've always hit hard because it's really not that far away from them. Then you bring in, to this year's staff, a guy like Jimmy Lindsey, a veteran guy that can help along the defensive line, basically takes the place of Ted Monachino, the role that he had last year with Monachino moving up to be the defensive line coach. He's a guy that came from LSU. So these are guys that are very, very familiar with this area. And it also feels like Jason Jones, the cornerbacks coach, has also done a lot of recruiting there as well. And so I really think that all of that has allowed Carolina to be more aggressive in that state. And look, when you go in there and land a guy like Alex Payne, and I get it. I mean, there's, some people that look at him and say, oh, he's a guy that's 265 along the offensive line. He's a guy that can put on the weight when he needs to. If you watch his film, it's a guy that deserves to be ranked as highly as he is. It's hard to imagine that the in-state teams weren't pursuing him aggressively. But Carolina's staff has really established a great relationship with the coaches in that area. We've talked about it, in the last few classes. You're going into the schools that produce some of the best players. Carolina's got a few guys that have come out of Buford. Walton is a school that Carolina has dipped into multiple times, including this last class. Mill Creek is one that Carolina has really started to establish a strong relationship with. That's where Devin Ankrum is from in this class. Carolina brought in 2 guys from there last year, and Aiden Banfield and Jaden Patterson. So, that's the thing. Carolina is doing what they have to do to establish themselves in their area. Are they the team that gets the pick of the litter and can really select the guys that they want? No, but even being in that second tier, I think has really allowed Carolina to be successful. Now, one of the things that's notable is that, yes, while Carolina is having success in the state of Georgia, it's in large part because they're not having success in their own state. And this is something that I think is really interesting because, look, we say that we like where the class stands right now. And I think from the perspective of the needs on the roster, the type of talent that they're bringing in, the level of talent that they're bringing in, you can be relatively satisfied with where Carolina is at. I think part of that is also just realizing that the results on the field have affected your ability to bring in the top level guys that you were bringing in when Mac Brown first arrived back. But one element that I think a lot of people are concerned about, and justifiably so, is what this team is doing in state. So far, of the 10 commitments, just 2 of them are from in-state. And one of them is Bryce Baker, the 4-star quarterback. So you love that. Trey Blue is the other guy that Carolina has got in the state of North Carolina. That alone is concerning enough. Then you get to the fact that when you go through and you look at all these other guys that Carolina has offered in the state and has been pursuing, and I'm not going to lie to you, I go through, I look at the top 34 the last time that I looked at it, guys in the state that are ranked. Those are the guys, those are the ones that have been ranked so far by 24/7 Sports. Carolina, they first of all haven't offered about half the guys in the state, which I find pretty interesting because in years past, they pretty much offered just about every guy in the state. They also are currently set to host just one other guy besides the 2 that are committed for an official visit. That is 4-star edge rusher Tayshawn Alston. And that's a guy that, if we're being honest, Carolina does not lead for him. That is South Carolina who has the lead for him. So, I mean, this I got to tell you, Zach, this is stunning to me how quickly things have dropped off in the home state, because for a while, and I know that we always talked about, hey, there are big names that are leaving the state and going to other schools like Georgia, like Clemson. Michigan has gotten involved in the state in recent years. But we are talking about now, Carolina is not even close to controlling their own state, it feels like, in this recruiting cycle. NC State seems to be doing a better job in the home state. Wake Forest seems to be doing a better job in the home state. And even Duke seems to be having a bigger impact at this point than Carolina has in the home state. You've got Bryce Baker in your back pocket, which is huge. But are you on the same level as me where it's shocking and maybe even a little concerning that Carolina is really struggling this bad in the home state in this cycle?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty surprising given where they were even 2 to 3 years ago. I mean, when we first started discussing the focus as it relates to recruiting for, Mac Brown and the staff, the initial staffs that were built, sort of controlling in-state recruiting was a big part of that. So, that has always been a big part of the strategy, at least from what we've discussed. Now, maybe there's a shift with that because, there were sort of varying results in terms of, for lack of a better term, the return on investment that they got on some of the guys that were local, that were, highly rated. They've had guys that have been, sort of that caliber, whether it be 4 or 5-star or top 50 that have not panned out, that have been local. So there may be that factor. I think I really don't know what to make of the fact that there's just guys that are in sort of the top, 34 or even top 20, that half of those guys don't have offers. I don't know what to make of that. And it could be a variety of reasons, but it is odd, like you mentioned, to just not have those offers go out at all. I mean, if they're not interested, they're not interested. But I think that's interesting, and that really decreases your pool. So if you're not even extending offers, it seems like there's the few guys that they're having success with, and then some of those guys that are in, the top, 5 to 6 in the state seem to be more guys that are going to leave. They may be recruitments that are more, NIL driven, or they're going to schools like Georgia, Tennessee, Clemson, which, you understand sort of the recruitments that you're getting in there. You understand that other schools may have, more advantageous situations there, which it's not something that people want to hear, but in some situations, you just have to understand that that's going to be the case. So I think it is a little odd. It's not super, it's not drastic because they're getting players other places. And in terms of, I guess, the in-state recruiting overall, I think that, the other in-state schools are doing about the same. Maybe I would say that NC State is having a little bit more, success in-state right now, but not to a degree where they're getting massive numbers of these guys that are, top 500 or top even 700 per se, maybe a few more here and there. But I don't think it's to an extent where we're seeing one of the in-state schools rule in-state recruiting. I think we're seeing a situation where, the top guys in the state, in any state, are going to go to some of these top schools, specifically the ones that are more local, like Clemson, Georgia, and Tennessee. And then the rest, by and large, are sort of split out based on the interests. So it is a concern. I'm not as concerned per se because they're getting guys elsewhere. And it seems more and more like geography is just becoming less and less important. But it is odd just because that's so much of a focus that we had before. And it's shocking to see that shift. Maybe this is just the new normal and they can still continue to get guys from other areas. And there's less of a concern on geography per se. It's just get the talent where it is. But it's still a little bit uncomfortable based on sort of these things that we had as sort of boilerplate statements for North Carolina recruiting, specifically under Mack Brown.
Well, yeah, I mean, the concerning part to me is more of the fact that, we heard when Mack Brown came back, there was the talk of building the fence around North Carolina and that the best players in the state are going to play here. And right now, I mean, for you to have two guys that are committed, and the more concerning thing is, look, that's fine. It makes sense. There are some big names. This is another state, by the way, just like Georgia, that is really on the rise in terms of the top prospects and developing some of the best in the world of college football. I would say, I mean, at this point, North Carolina is pushing hard to be one of the top 10 states in the country in terms of producing these types of players. If not, I mean, on the precipice of getting near the top 5. I mean, you just look at this year's class, and this is the thing. This is the reason why it's so disappointing. Because you're talking about, according to 24/7 Sports Composite, you've got David Sanders in this class, who is the number 2 overall player nationally. You got Isaiah Campbell, the number 33 overall player. Bryce Davis, the number 51 overall player, and Jordan Young, the number 67. Those are guys that are just ranked inside the top 75. And the concerning thing is you don't have a single official visit scheduled with any of those guys. You couldn't even get to that. You're eliminated before you even get to June. Where in the past, yeah, Carolina was missing on those guys. Or, I mean, when, for a while there, you talked about some of the big name talent that they brought in. They were the top competitors for a lot of these guys. I mean, remember all the concerns we heard about, Travis Shaw could go out of state. Carolina got him. There have been guys in the past where Carolina was in the running until the end and then they fall out. This is just, they are not even close to that at this point. David Sanders Jr. eliminated Carolina back in, early winter. Isaiah Campbell didn't even feel like he was ever really considering anybody but Clemson. So that one, you can't really fault him for. Bryce Davis was a guy that Carolina established themselves well with early. They made the change along the defensive line and sort of lost some ground. They then had to work their way back into it, make it all up. And now, after they were set to host him for an official visit, it appears that's no longer going to happen. And who does that official visit get replaced by on his schedule? Duke. So, I mean, that's the thing. It's stuff like that that's concerning. Now, he'll probably ultimately end up going out of state. I think Georgia's the favorite for him. Clemson is probably number 2, and then Duke would be in that conversation. But still, I mean, you were there with at least a chance to get him on campus and try to show him that this is a place that he can stay. There's guys that have come from Grimsley that have had plenty of success at Carolina. And it just, for some reason, it's not working out. And Jordan Young, another guy. I mean, there's guys that Carolina, a few, and like I said, number 5 player overall in the state, Jaden Blair, is a guy that Carolina hasn't even offered him. Now, I mean, look, there are other things that could go into that. Maybe it has to do with academics, whatever. But to not even be in the running for him, I think is the part that is shocking. And this is something that you just see it across the board with guys in this state. And there are guys that Carolina has been fighting to try to be in the running for, and they've been eliminated. So we'll see. And the other concerning part for this is, when you don't value the home state, that is usually the sign of things are starting to fray a little bit. And I don't know if it's that the relationships in the state aren't as strong as they used to be. I don't know if it's just that they really like some of the guys that are coming from Georgia. The thing that concerns me a lot about this, Zach, and I'll be interested to hear what you think about this, is remember that when things really started to change and where things took a turn for the worst, and I'm not saying it's going to get this bad, but this is very similar to what we saw with Larry Fedora, where all of a sudden the in-state guys were not interested in coming to Carolina. And part of it was that the staff was valuing a lot of guys. Remember, for them, Florida was really big. That was the state that Carolina wanted to get into. And they simply couldn't get the top talent in that state. I think they're doing a better job with the state of Georgia getting some of those top guys this time around. And I think that's, because of the success that Mac Brown has had and some of the other guys on that staff. But it does feel a little bit like that to me. And that's where I'm starting to get a little concerned.
Yeah, and I definitely understand that. I mean, that's one of the first things that comes to mind when you mention that for folks that have followed recruiting, is you look at, how the sort of previous staff or previous head coach, sort of what happened at the end. And it's an exact, sort of similar scenario where you don't focus as much on the home state. You allow other programs to really establish themselves in there. And then, you see overall, things fall off. I think that there is a little bit of a different factor, here that there was with Larry Fedora. Larry Fedora was not recruiting in an environment that had, NIL and then the transfer portal to the extent that we have now. So I think things are pretty different in that regard. So I think that is one factor that, affects North Carolina with some of these guys. That's not everyone, though. So there is something, along those lines where some of these guys that are number 1, number 2, those decisions might be NIL based. And in that instance where, that you're not going to get to a certain level, those discussions may happen early enough, which sort of explains why you don't have an official visit. But some of these guys, like you mentioned, a guy like a Bryce Davis, like a Jordan Young, you feel like you can at least get on campus. And even if you don't ultimately get them, there's sort of this idea of, I guess, just perception or optics, where you at least want to be bringing guys into campus. You would like to have those relationships, especially in a world where you have the transfer portal, because we see situations where, you see a guy like Jacoby Cohen that originally went to Ohio State, had that built-in relationship with the staff, and then came back. So that's a big factor there. If you have a guy that goes somewhere, wants to transfer, then you have that relationship. So I think that it's a little bit different. There's a little bit of different factors to stand here, but that's really what's going to be the ultimate two things. Whatever the NIL situation is, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent, it's going to be what it is. So, there's not really a ton that we can say about that per se, but I think one of the main things to focus on is going to be, what this new staff, what this staff this year, next year, and the coming years can show in development. I mean, some of those guys that you mentioned in the top 5 in state, they are, defensive guys. North Carolina has had sort of an ongoing issue. They've been, some instances, they've been legitimately bad. Some they've just been okay on the defensive side. But we've seen, the places that they're having the majority of success are places that they've continued to have success at quarterback, running back, wide receiver. Occasionally, you'll have a pretty good inside linebacker, but they need to figure out and develop the guys that they have at, specifically on the back end and on the line, so defensive line and defensive back, and show that they are a place that is going to be developmental in that regard. I think that's probably outside of, any sort of potential compensatory model. So NIL, whatever comes of anything in the future in terms of compensation, development is going to be the key. And I think that's something that North Carolina is going to need to step up into, because, these guys in the home state, they have the most eyeballs on you. They know who you are better than anyone else. And so that means that they know what you're best at, but they also know what you're worst at. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest things, is it's going to be incumbent on this staff, whether guys be from North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, wherever, they have to show an increased emphasis on their development to, to really show that they can get guys to the league, because that's going to be one of the biggest things moving forward. I feel if you're not going to be, quote unquote, the highest bidder in any sort of circumstance, you're going to need to show that you have a path to being a smart business decision. And, there's a lot of changes going on. That's not something that everyone, wants to hear. They want guys that want to, stay home and play for, the home state. That's not always going to be the case. And that's not just a North Carolina issue or an obstacle that they're going to have to overcome. That's everywhere. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest things, is sort of, continuing to address your development, continuing to address, how you send guys to the NFL. If you see that increase in certain positions, I feel like there'll be something more that you'll be able to sell to sort of resalvage these relationships you have, if it's not, the overall staff relationships that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, those are great points. And I think that's something that maybe I need to take more into account. The NIL, I mean, look, we know that Carolina right now is just not able to keep up like some of these other schools are. There's a reason why they had the Heels for Life campaign that they had back in the winter. Mac Brown has said it multiple times when he's been on the stand during pressers, that Carolina right now needs as much help as they can get in NIL, because right now they just don't have the money to keep up, whether it's in the transfer portal or at the high school level. And the developmental thing, I think, is a great point, because you're right. When you look at the positions of the top guys in this state, in this class, David Sanders, offensive tackle. Carolina's offensive line has been horrible towards the end of the last 2 years. And, I mean, the other thing about it is he probably looks and says, I mean, they have stability there this year. Prior to this year, Carolina had 3 offensive line coaches in 3 years. You look at the defensive line, where you have Isaiah Campbell and Bryce Davis. Yeah, Carolina's done a good job of recruiting that spot. Now that was something that was a strength of Tim Cross, but when the guys have gotten here, they haven't necessarily been developed the way that they need to. I mean, let's be honest. How many of those guys right now are we expecting to go to the NFL? Like Miles Murphy got there. He was a guy that was a 4-star player inside of the top, if I remember correctly, inside the top 200 prospects coming out of high school. This is a guy that didn't even get drafted. He had to he's going to have to make a roster as an undrafted free agent. And I got to be honest, there's some other guys that were ranked just as highly as him. I don't even know if they're going to get a chance to make it to the league in that capacity. So, I mean, that's the thing that right now I think is just stunning, is especially in the trenches, those are the guys that haven't really been developed. And then, I mean, you've got 2 safeties, Jordan Young, Jaden Blair. Those are guys that, I mean, with Jordan Young, yeah, I mean, maybe it is NIL based, but it could also be that, he looks at some of the safeties that Carolina has rolled through. That's not a position where they've produced a lot of guys. So that's definitely something, because you look, I mean, they've got the top quarterback in the state. Wide receiver, they haven't really looked a lot in state for those guys. I don't think this is the greatest wide receiver class. I mean, you've got Shamarius Peterkin, who I think was a guy that Carolina fans were hoping Carolina could be more involved with. I think, look, they're there. I don't remember. I thought they were going to host him, but maybe he does not. Yeah, he does not have an official visit date listed. So that's one maybe you keep an eye on, see if he ends up adding Carolina somewhere along the way. That's one that I think a lot of people would look at and say, why is he not a guy that Carolina's more interested in? Jarrell Boulder, who I think NC State just got out to a really great start with, and Carolina, I think, knows that and just said, look, we're going to focus elsewhere at that position. So, I mean, that's the thing is we'll see. And what's frustrating is that you see the top guys in this class. I mean, the next class is an incredibly talented one, and you're hoping that Carolina at some point can get back to that level of dominance. But part of it is, if you want Carolina to recruit at that level again in state, you're going to have to be willing to help the NIL collectives. For now, we'll see. Eventually, we could get to the point that Mac Brown's trying to get college sports too, when he talks to the media, and I'm with him, where he wants at some point for the universities to actually be able to pay these players, for it to be collectively bargained. And look, I think what's going on right now in college athletics probably is getting us a step closer, where the schools are basically having to pay out revenue to current players, and they're even having to give back pay to players of the last 10 years. That could maybe lay the groundwork for eventually it being the schools are the ones that are basically paying these guys, because it's not going backwards. I think it needs to get to that level for Carolina, because unless all of a sudden we've got donors that are really going to put a big focus on football NIL, I don't know how Carolina is going to keep up. And that next class, I mean, you talk about how good this class is. In the next class, you have right now, you have 7 guys ranked inside the top 100 from the state. And I mean, there's 3 more guys that are ranked inside of the top 200. So 10 guys total ranked inside of the top 200, according to 24/7 Sports Composite. And if they're ranking you that early, you are really good. So Carolina's got some work to do to try to make sure that they can compete in this state moving forward. A couple of closing notes on the way out, and a couple of things we'll discuss off of it. First one, a couple of weeks ago, Carolina loses one of their 3-star linebacker targets, a guy that Carolina for a while was in pretty good standing with. It seemed like it was going to be them in South Carolina, but some of the teams from the middle of the country got involved, and Sam Haley, the 3-star linebacker out of the state of Tennessee, he ends up going to TCU. Now, the question is that with him off the board, Carolina, I mean, they've already got Anthony Crua, who I know is listed as an edge rusher. There might be people looking at that and saying, why are you talking about him as a linebacker? If you weren't, if you didn't listen to the edition of the podcast when I broke him down when he committed, and if you did not read the article, this is a guy that I think, while he's listed as an edge rusher, he fits the linebacker spot to a T. He just plays edge rusher because, just like a lot of these guys, especially on the defensive side of the ball in high school, they put you at the spot that you can make the most impact if you are that athletic. And for him, edge rusher was that spot. At 6'2", 210, he's a guy that is going to play linebacker, and he's going to be pretty successful at doing it. So the question is, Zach, now that Sam Haley is off the board, a lot of guys that Carolina has offered already committed elsewhere. They do have one guy, Chase Taylor, that's a guy out of the state of Georgia that they could potentially be looking at, but he's a guy that right now seems to have 4 teams that are standing out, and Carolina is not one of them. Do you think that Carolina is still looking for somebody at that linebacker spot, or might they be content, especially with the last 2 classes where they have brought in 3 linebackers in each of those classes to build some of that depth up?
Yeah, well, you never want to say never as it relates to that. I think sort of the axiom in recruiting is you can always have one more at really any position, but I think that they are content if it's just Anthony Crua. They're going to be fine with that in terms of their sort of linebacker haul. Like you mentioned, they've gotten 3 guys each of the last 2 classes. So you have, 6 guys for 2 spots right now that are underclassmen. Obviously, you have one upperclassman that you are probably going to lose in Power Eccles. But besides that, you've got all freshmen and sophomores there. I mean, maybe you'll see if you lose maybe one to the transfer portal, but obviously there's a lot of opportunity there. So these guys are going to see the opportunity for to compete for starting time. You're likely going to see a sophomore at one of the starting positions here this fall. So, you've got this situation where you've got, like we mentioned at the top of the show, you've got a lot of young players at this position. So I think that they're content with what they have. If there's something that comes available, and maybe there's some late bloomer that they really want to have, they might go that way. But I think it's a situation where they're good with one. Maybe they feel that they have more depth at, the position where they want to take more in 26 after taking so many in 23 and 24. So I think that they're good with what they have. If something comes up, they can always adjust. But I think that they're perfectly fine taking one linebacker in this class.
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations where if there is someone like an in-state guy that all of a sudden jumps off the page, maybe someone out of the state of Georgia that comes out of nowhere, they might be willing to take that person in this class, but they're content with where they're at because, as you mentioned, a lot of underclassmen, you're only scheduled to lose Power Eccles. And the thing is, if you do lose somebody to the transfer portal, you always have the option to replace them. And I also think that they want to leave a spot open in case maybe, you look at this group that's behind Power Eccles and Amari Campbell. You're looking for somebody to step up, not only to be able to rotate in this year, which you definitely need, but also you're looking for someone that can sort of give you a peek into the future and say and give you some hope of, okay, this is the guy that can run alongside Amari Campbell moving forward. If you don't see that, you want to leave a scholarship spot open at least for you to be able to go and get a veteran that can help you at that position. So I agree. I think they're probably satisfied with Krua. He's a guy that's going to be a little bit developmental, but I really like what I see from him, and I think there's a lot of potential there. And I think they're okay with that. Now, another guy that committed, he actually committed earlier this week. There's an article on the website that you guys can read about that and what Carolina may do at the position, is 2025 three-star interior offensive lineman Anthony Cade Ogamoro. He ends up going to Tennessee. Now, this is a guy that the reason this is somewhat important is that this is another guy. He just transferred to a high school in Oklahoma this offseason. He had to. His dad is in the military. He got reassigned to a base out in Oklahoma. He makes the move out there. But this was a guy that was an in-state prospect. Went to White Oak High School, which is in Jacksonville, North Carolina. And Carolina was the one team in state that really had a legitimate shot at him. State was there for a little while, but I think this is a guy that Carolina looked at and said, if we can add him on the interior of the offensive line, then we're going to. He was a guy that was, he is built to play. I mean, he's listed as an offensive tackle. If you look at him on 24/7 Sports, he is a perfect fit for the interior of the offensive line at 6'4", 320. He could probably come in, and if you needed him to at that size, he could play immediately just from a height weight standpoint. I think this is one of those situations, Zach, you look at it and does Carolina need to add someone more along the interior of the offensive line? I don't think you can ever have too many offensive linemen. I'm going to be honest with you, and especially the interior of this group. We've seen the way that Carolina struggled at times. But this is a group of interior offensive linemen that Carolina has right now. You'll probably lose Willie Lampkin at the end of the season, I believe. I don't think he's a COVID guy. It's incredibly difficult to still keep up with that to this day. But if you end up losing him, that's your one guy that you lose. Everybody else would be back. And this is an extremely young group. It's an area where they brought in a lot of guys in this past class. What do you think about them potentially adding another guy along the interior of the offensive line? Because very similar to linebacker, there's not anybody that it looks like Carolina is really standing out with at this point. I think this is probably a spot where they would have liked to add him, but now that he's off the board, they're probably just going to hold on to what they got.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to say one way or the other if they need to go after somebody else or not, because it's a situation where they felt really good about where they stood. I mean, I thought that they were in a really good spot prior to this commitment. So it's difficult to say if it's a situation where they need, an interior offensive guy specifically, or if they just really had a good shot, with this guy in this class. Overall, when you look at the roster, I mean, I think it's, like you mentioned, I think it's a good mix of upperclassmen and then younger guys in that room. It's a room, like you mentioned, where, they have the potential to, play their starting 5 this year and then return 4 of those 5 the next year. So I don't think that there's a huge need. I think that they're fine if they do sort of, hold off at that spot. And then we see them maybe, do something similar to this past offseason where they look and see if there's a guy that they can find in the portal. If you are going to portal for offensive linemen, I think it's a little bit easier to get an interior guy as opposed to an offensive tackle. And then, something I think that I would also consider is just as they bring in guys, it is generally easier to shift a guy inside than it is outside. And we've seen that a little bit to a degree. I mean, you look at a guy like Zach Rice that came out of high school as a high-rated offensive tackle. Thus far, he's been sort of slotted into, one of those guard spots in the offensive line. So I think because you have that versatility there, you don't need necessarily to add another guy. And I think that they got probably, at least 3 guys in the past class that can play on the interior. So I don't think it's a huge position of need. But it does hurt that you lost this guy that you felt like you had a really good shot at, and that you thought you were going to be able to at least, have a chance to go into official visits with. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. But I don't think they need to reach anywhere. I think that they're good with where they're at. And then, if you want to look in the portal, either in, December or in, sort of this, or I guess not December, but in sort of December, January into sort of that post-spring, grouping that we've seen, they can look there and they can probably find someone if they really, really need someone in a pinch.
Yeah. And I mean, look, there are guys that are joining the team that weren't there in the spring that Carolina has brought in. A couple of guys. I mean, Zach Greenberg out of the portal is a guy that's coming in. He's got multiple years left that will play on the interior of that offensive line. There's a lot of young guys that the staff really likes, led by Aiden Banfield. So I think they're pretty comfortable with where they're at. And look, if they don't feel like somebody steps up, because they have to find somebody at that left guard spot. It looks like Malik McGowan might be the guy there for right now. Greenberg will come in and potentially challenge him, but it looks to me like McGowan may have taken that leap to be the starter there. He's a guy that, by the way, can come back next year as well. But let's say they don't see somebody that emerges at right guard. Okay, well, you can always go to the portal. And you're right. That's a spot. First of all, we've seen that they are more than willing to take guys out of the portal along the offensive line. I mean, they brought in 4 guys along the offensive line this year out of the portal alone. So they are more than willing to use the portal to find those guys. I think it's always, that's one of those positions. We've talked about it so many times before. Guys coming out of high school along the offensive and defensive line, there is a steep learning curve. And the offensive line, I think even more at times than the defensive line, it is incredibly steep. And so I think they want guys that are proven. I mean, especially like I look at a position where I would like to bring somebody in, the center spot. They're not bringing somebody in at the center spot. It's not happening. They've proven to you that they went out, got Corey Gaynor. They liked what they saw from him. They've gone out, got Austin Blasky in this class. Really like what they've seen from him as well so far. We'll see if that translates on the field. That feels like that's going to be their strategy there moving forward. In the interior of the offensive line, especially with the success that you've seen from Willie Lampkin, just as a whole, those 3 spots, it feels like if they have to cover their bases, they will use the transfer portal to be able to do that. So I think that's probably the reason why they won't take anybody else in this class too. Very similar to linebacker. I think you want to leave a spot open because if you have a transfer that you really like, that you want to bring in that can help you immediately as a veteran, you want to be able to do that. And so, I mean, you've got a guy in Alex Payne who is tremendous, huge upside, a guy you're hoping can eventually be the future of that left tackle spot for you. And then you got Trey Blue, who is underrated. I feel like he's a guy that even though he'll probably end up finishing right near the top 1,000, somewhere bordering on that. I love his size. I love his physicality. He's a guy that I really do think that in time, I don't think he's going to be a guy that has to be developed, but in time, he could be very similar to Malik McGowan. And if you can stay with the same offensive line coach, which would be a miracle, hopefully this offensive line takes enough of a step where they do, then that would help as well. Last thing here, really quickly, Carolina hosting 2 running backs in the class, 2 4-stars that will take official visits to Carolina that have added them to their schedule here late. Bo Walker, who's a guy who's committed to Georgia right now, a guy ranked just inside of the top 400 at a Cedar Grove High School there in Ellenwood, Georgia. So again, going into that state, this is a guy that I think, is very similar in my mind to what Davian Gauss was a year ago, where he is a guy that has put together some amazing stats, but he's a guy that even though he is in the backyard of a powerhouse, last year Gauss was a guy that was right in Miami's backyard, that this is a guy that I just don't know, like for Georgia, I think they have their eyes on bigger prizes. And so this may be an opportunity for Carolina to capitalize. This is the one team that it seems like he really has opened the door for. Carolina, as well as Georgia Tech, is another one to also keep an eye on. But Carolina for sure really seems like they're the team that's pushing them hard. And then another guy that just announced that earlier this week, he will be Inside Carolina actually announced it earlier this week. He will be on campus for an official visit during the second week of official visits. Jabari Wallace-Coleman, a guy out of Philadelphia, and he is a guy that in-state, Penn State is the team that's been the long-standing favorite for him. But they have already landed a running back in this class, another 4-star, and Alvin Henderson, a guy that Carolina had offered as well in the class. This is a situation where if Carolina can really show that they value him more, their track record speaks for itself of the success that they've had with their running backs. I think they could have a legitimate shot here. He will be on campus June 11th through the 13th. That's right before a big visit weekend. He's going to be there by himself. This could really be an advantage for Carolina. So we'll monitor all of that. And we'll keep you up to date with everything on the Heel Tough Blog website, heeltoughblog.com. Guys, make sure you head over there right now. Whole bunch of stuff about all of the stuff that we just talked about. Carolina, the guys that Carolina has missed on. We got Anthony Cade Ogamoro, that article up there about him. We've got a little bit more information on where things stand in the recruitment of Jabari Wallace-Coleman, Bo Walker, and Carolina getting those official visits from those guys. And we'll keep you up to date on anything that happens. We'll also have a primer that will come out before Carolina starts on May 31st. So make sure that you guys keep an eye out for all of that as they start. That's the start date for a huge month of official visits that will determine a lot about where Carolina will stand in the 2025 class when it is all said and done. On the basketball side of things, Carolina just landed Vin Allen Lubin to add to their front court. We have plenty of stuff up about that, and we'll be covering you throughout the rest of the offseason. Josh is taking you through the offers that Carolina has handed out in the 2025 class and their first offer in the 2026 class. And, of course, on the podcast side of things, you can listen to that podcast, the Four Corners podcast. Same place you get this podcast. Also, we were live. There is the video that you can go back and check out if you want to consume it that way, where we talked about Vin Allen Lubin, what he brings to the table. Me and Josh, a little bit of a disagreement about where exactly he's going to play. So listen to that. Tell us what you think. We would really appreciate that. And, of course, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to this podcast, keep an eye out. Next week, me and Zach will be back, and we'll be getting you ready for that huge official visit month with a look at all the guys that will be on campus and some of the other stuff that'll be going on, like what is the most important week for Carolina during that month. All of that stuff is on deck for you guys as things really start to pick up. But for now, we shut it down for this edition of the podcast. Want to thank you, Zach, for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.